By 1781, the American Revolution was grinding to a halt. After 6 long years of war, the dream of independence was fading. The conflict was a bitter stalemate, balanced on a knife's edge. But then, 2 things happened at once. A British general made a fatal error, positioning his army on a remote Virginia peninsula. At the same time, George Washington saw his one last chance for a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. What followed was a masterpiece of military deception. A secret march, a perfectly timed naval blockade, and a siege that would change history. How could a seemingly lost cause turn into the perfect trap, deciding the fate of a nation at a place called Yorktown? Before the final gamble at Yorktown, the war had taken a dark and bloody turn. With the northern colonies locked in a stalemate, British command devised a new plan. It was called the Southern Strategy. The idea was simple: march south, rally loyalist support, and crush the rebellion from the bottom up. The man tasked with this was General Charles Cornwallis. At first, the strategy seemed brilliant. In August 1780, he crushed an American army at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. It was a total disaster for the Patriots. The British rolled through the South with an air of complete invincibility. It looked like the war was almost over. But George Washington sent his most capable general, Nathaniel Greene, to fix the mess. Greene was no fool. He knew he couldn't beat Cornwallis in a straight fight, so he decided not to. His plan was simple but genius. He would make the British army chase him all over the Carolinas, trading space for time. This new strategy led to a series of brutal clashes. At the Battle of Cowpens, the Americans brilliantly tricked the British into a devastating trap. Then came the much bloodier Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis won that battle technically, but the cost was absolutely immense. He lost nearly 1/4 of his entire force in a single day of fighting. He famously said, "I never saw such fighting since God made me." These were Pyrrhic victories. Cornwallis was winning himself into a corner. His army was exhausted, bleeding men, and running dangerously low on supplies. He had marched hundreds of miles with little to show for it. The Southern strategy had failed to pacify the countryside. In fact, it had only enraged it. Frustrated and depleted, Cornwallis made a decision that would seal his fate. He abandoned the chaotic Carolinas and marched his tired army north. He headed into Virginia seeking a defensible position. He needed a deep water port where the Royal Navy could find and resupply him. He chose a small tobacco port on a peninsula, a place called Yorktown. So how does a veteran general like Cornwallis march 7,000 professional soldiers onto a narrow strip of land surrounded by water? Was he asking for trouble? From our perspective, it looks like a terrible mistake. But from his, it was a perfectly logical move based on one simple fact: the Royal Navy was invincible. His primary goal was to establish a defensible deep-water naval base, a place where he could rest his exhausted army and be resupplied by sea. Yorktown, on the bank of the York River, was perfect for this. The river was deep enough for the largest British warships to anchor safely. He also seized Gloucester Point on the opposite shore, giving him total control of the river's mouth. Adding to the situation was his boss back in New York, General Sir Henry Clinton. Their relationship was, to put it mildly, dysfunctional. Their correspondence was a mess of vague instructions and passive-aggressive jabs. Clinton wanted a naval station in the Chesapeake Bay, but seemed incapable of deciding exactly where. Cornwallis was simply trying to follow confusing orders from a superior he clearly disliked. So he chose Yorktown. He had his port, he had a defensible position, and he had what he believed was an unbreakable lifeline to the most powerful navy on the planet. The idea that the French fleet could sail across the Atlantic, arrive at exactly the right moment, and defeat the Royal Navy in its own backyard was not just unlikely. It was considered impossible. For Cornwallis, the sea was not a threat. It was his guaranteed escape route, his ultimate insurance policy. He began to dig in, ordering his men to build a network of fortifications called redoubts. He was preparing not for a trap, but for a temporary stay before resuming the fight. He believed he had found a sanctuary. In reality, he had just walked into a cage and handed the key to his enemies. With Cornwallis digging in, his opponents were finally ready to act. That spring, George Washington met with the French commander, Count Rochambeau, in Connecticut. The alliance was under pressure and patience was running low. For Washington, the target was clear: New York City. This was more than a military objective, it was a personal obsession. The city was the main British headquarters in America. Its capture would be a spectacular, war-ending victory. Washington could simply think of nothing else. Rochambeau, a pragmatic and seasoned veteran, was far less enthusiastic. He commanded a professional army of 5,000 disciplined French soldiers. From his experience, he knew a direct assault on a fortified city like New York would be a bloody nightmare. He listened politely but privately thought the entire plan was reckless. They eventually reached a difficult compromise. The French army would march to join Washington's forces outside New York. Together, they would make a show of preparing for a joint attack. But they both knew it was a hollow plan without one critical piece. They needed total naval superiority. On August the 14th, that help was finally promised. A dusty courier arrived with a letter from Admiral de Grasse, commander of the French fleet in the West Indies. The news it contained was absolutely electrifying. De Grasse was sailing north with a massive force of warships. He was also bringing thousands of extra soldiers. But there was a stunning catch that changed everything. The admiral was not sailing for New York. His one and only destination was the Chesapeake Bay. Even more importantly, his orders were strict. He could only stay for a matter of weeks, and not a day longer. The clock was already ticking very loudly. In that single moment, the entire strategy of the war pivoted. Washington's long-held dream of liberating New York had to be abandoned instantly. A different, far more promising opportunity had just fallen from the sky. The target was no longer New York. The trap was about to be set in Virginia. The decision was made. The combined Franco-American army would march on Virginia. There was just one very large problem. General Clinton and his main British army of 10,000 men were sitting in New York City. He was watching every single move Washington made. If Clinton realized what was happening, the entire plan would fail disastrously. So Washington decided to put on a show. It was a grand piece of military theater designed for an audience of one. A small portion of the army remained visible near New York, making a lot of noise. The real deception began across the river in New Jersey. Soldiers were ordered to build huge encampments, clearly visible to British lookouts. These camps were designed to look permanent. To sell the lie, they included massive brick bread ovens. Ovens like that were a clear sign of an army settling in for a very long siege. It was the 18th century equivalent of signing a year-long lease. The performance didn't stop with construction. Washington's spies went to work. They spread carefully crafted rumors through New York's taverns about an imminent attack. Forged documents detailing plans for an assault on the city were created. These papers were then given to messengers who were instructed to get themselves captured. Washington even held loud conversations where he knew British spies were listening. It was a masterclass in misdirection, playing perfectly on Clinton's own anxieties. He became utterly convinced that a massive assault was just moments away. He ordered his men to dig in and prepare for the fight of their lives. And while Clinton stared intently at the smoke rising from the fake camps, the real show was happening behind his back. On August 19th, the bulk of the French and American armies quietly turned around. They began slipping away, marching south. The Great Deception had worked perfectly. The trap was now in motion. The deception worked. Now came the truly hard part. An army of over 7,000 men began to move south. This was a combined force of Washington's battle-hardened Continentals and disciplined French regulars. Their destination was a secret so tightly guarded that most of the men had no idea where they were going. They simply followed orders, marching into the unknown. Moving an army this size was a logistical masterpiece in the making. We can visualize a river of men, horses, and heavy iron cannons stretching for miles along dusty roads. Their route would cover a punishing 450 miles. It was a relentless race against the calendar and against discovery. The first major test was the Hudson River. Getting thousands of men and tons of equipment across the wide river required an entire fleet of ferry boats working in perfect coordination. These boats worked around the clock in absolute secrecy. Each crossing was a delicate operation where a single British patrol could expose the entire plan. Yet, they managed it flawlessly. For weeks, the army snaked its way south through New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The soldiers marched with a disciplined urgency, often covering 15 miles a day. They endured suffocating late summer heat and choking dust. The French, with their immaculate white uniforms, were a particular sight for the locals. For many Americans, this was their first glimpse of such a powerful military force. It was a tangible sign their alliance was real. By early September, the secrecy finally broke when the army reached Philadelphia. As thousands of troops marched through the revolutionary capital, their southern direction was undeniable. The city erupted in celebration as congressmen cheered from the streets. The soldiers, who had been marching blind for weeks, finally understood their true mission. A surge of renewed purpose ran through the ranks. The Great March South was now a public declaration. General Clinton had been completely fooled. While Washington's army marched south, the success of their entire mission depended on a man most of them had never met. The war's focus now shifted from dusty roads to the blue waters of the Caribbean Sea. Everything rested on Admiral de Grasse. François-Joseph Paul, the Comte de Grasse, was an old sea dog. He was a tough, aristocratic veteran who had spent his entire life fighting the British Royal Navy. He was not known for his caution. He understood this was a moment for a decisive all-in gamble. He commanded a massive fleet of 28 ships of the line. To put that in perspective, these were the aircraft carriers of their day. They were floating wooden fortresses, each bristling with dozens of heavy cannons. It was a force powerful enough to challenge British naval supremacy. But cannons and ships were useless without money to pay soldiers and buy supplies. The French treasury was, as usual, practically empty. So, before sailing for Virginia, de Grasse made a risky detour. He sailed his entire fleet to Havana, a neutral Spanish port. There, he engaged in some frantic, last-minute fundraising. He essentially went hat in hand to the Spanish officials and merchants of the city. Amazingly, in just a few days, they managed to collect a staggering 1,200,000 silver livres for the American cause. With the silver secured, de Grasse loaded his ships for the final journey. He wasn't just bringing a war chest. He also carried a reinforcement of 3,200 fresh French soldiers. His fleet weighed anchor and disappeared over the horizon, heading north. A high-stakes race had begun. De Grasse had to navigate treacherous waters and evade the powerful British fleet he knew was hunting for him. The fate of the revolution was no longer in Washington's hands. It now rested on a French admiral, sailing a fleet funded by Spanish silver in a desperate dash to Virginia. On the morning of September the 5th, a forest of masts appeared on the horizon off the Virginia coast. It was the British fleet. Admiral Thomas Graves had arrived from New York with 19 ships of the line, expecting to find a small French squadron that could be easily brushed aside. What he found instead was Admiral de Grasse's entire battle fleet, blocking his path to Yorktown. De Grasse was caught slightly off guard. Many of his sailors were ashore, helping to unload troops. But the old sea dog didn't hesitate for a moment. He knew this was the decisive engagement. He ordered his available warships to cut their anchor cables and sail out to meet the British head-on. It was a scramble, but it was absolutely necessary. The two fleets slowly formed up for battle. Naval combat in this era was a rigid and formal affair. Fleets would sail in a long single-file column known as the line of battle. This formation allowed each ship to fire its devastating broadside cannons at the enemy line. Victory depended on discipline, firepower, and clear communication. Unfortunately for the British, clear communication was in short supply that day. Admiral Graves hoisted a series of signal flags to command his fleet, but the signals were confusing and seemed to contradict each other. The lead ships in his line interpreted the order as a full-scale attack. The ships in the rear of the line saw a different signal, ordering them to maintain the strict formation. The result was a partial, disjointed engagement. The front of the British line sailed into a brutal close-range slugfest with the French. For hours, the cannons roared. But the rest of Graves' fleet sailed on, mostly out of range and unable to help. The British ships that did fight took a terrible pounding. One warship, aptly named HMS Terrible, was so full of holes it was barely staying afloat. As evening fell, the two battered fleets drifted apart. After several days of cautious maneuvering, Graves made his decision. His fleet was too damaged to continue the fight. He ordered a retreat back to New York. The French now had complete control of the sea. The door to Cornwallis's cage had just been slammed shut and locked for good. The dust of a 450-mile journey finally settled. On September 26th, the exhausted but determined soldiers of Washington and Rochambeau marched into Williamsburg, Virginia. The secret was out, the long race was won, but they were not the only ones there. A grand and long-awaited reunion was about to take place. Waiting for them were the American forces commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette. For months, Lafayette's men had skillfully shadowed Cornwallis across Virginia, playing a frustrating game of cat and mouse. Now their lonely vigil was over. Adding to this assembly were the 3,200 fresh French infantry, brought by Admiral de Grasse. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. It was an incredible sight. According to sources from the period, the combined Allied force now numbered over 17,600 men. This was a military machine on a scale rarely seen in North America. Disciplined French regulars in their crisp white uniforms stood next to Washington's rugged, battle-hardened Continentals. It was a physical embodiment of a powerful alliance, now aimed at one single point on the map. We can only guess what Cornwallis was thinking just 12 miles down the road. He already knew the French fleet had locked the door behind him. Now, he was receiving reports of this colossal army gathering on his lawn. This was the worst kind of surprise party. His 7,000 soldiers were now outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. His sanctuary had become a cage, and the hunters were right outside. There was no time to waste. 2 days later, the drums beat the advance. The massive Allied army began its final short march out of Williamsburg. They moved with a grim purpose, their destination Yorktown. The ring of steel was complete. French warships controlled the sea at his back. This immense army was now closing in on his front. The time for marching was over. The time for digging was about to begin. A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. With the Allied army at his doorstep, Cornwallis made a surprising first move. He ordered his men to abandon their outer defenses. These were a series of small, isolated forts called redoubts. He pulled all his troops back into his main fortifications around the town. To his critics, this decision was a terrible blunder. It was an unforced error that puzzled military observers then and now. He essentially handed the Allies the perfect, uncontested spot to start digging their siege lines, a gift they quickly accepted. Siege warfare in the 18th century was not a mad rush at the walls. It was a slow, deliberate, and deadly science. The goal was to methodically close in on the enemy, applying pressure bit by bit until they cracked. This was done by digging a series of massive trenches, known as parallels, that crept ever closer to the enemy defenses. This work was led by highly skilled military engineers. The French, in particular, were masters of this methodical art of war. The real work began under the cover of darkness. On the night of October the 6th, thousands of Allied soldiers moved forward in complete silence. They carried not muskets, but shovels and picks. This was not a job for infantry, but for construction crews under constant threat. It was tense, backbreaking labor. A single stray sound could alert British sentries and bring down a deadly volley of cannon fire. All night, they dug into the Virginia soil, their lives depending on their quiet efficiency and their luck. By morning, the result was astonishing. A new trench, over 2,000 yards long, now faced the British positions. This was the first parallel. It had been dug in a single night, an incredible feat of engineering and disciplined labor. This trench was more than just a hiding place. It was a protected roadway. Shielded from enemy fire, soldiers began the hard work of hauling their heavy siege cannons into newly built positions called batteries. Dozens of massive guns, some weighing several tons, were painstakingly moved into place along the new parallel. The first and most crucial step of the siege was complete. The methodical tightening of the noose was underway. Now, the real noise was about to begin. By the afternoon of October 9th, the digging was done. The methodical silence that had defined the start of the siege was about to be shattered. For several days, the British had watched the Allies build their positions, waiting for the inevitable. Now the Allies were ready to respond, and their response would be overwhelmingly loud. Legend says George Washington himself was given the honor of firing the first American cannon. He lit the fuse, and a moment later a cannonball smashed into a house in Yorktown. The shot reportedly killed a British officer just as he sat down for dinner. It was a brutal opening statement. The bombardment had begun. This was no minor exchange of fire. The Allies had brought an orchestra of destruction to the party. Over 100 pieces of heavy artillery were now aimed at the British lines. There were massive siege cannons, some of the finest in the world from French arsenals. Alongside them were heavy mortars, designed to lob explosive shells high into the air, dropping them directly into the British trenches. The noise was continuous and overwhelming. Day and night, an iron storm rained down. The ground shook with every single impact. We can only imagine the psychological effect on the trapped soldiers. There was no escape from the sound, and nowhere to hide from the danger. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every moment was filled with the terrifying roar of cannons and the constant whistle of incoming shells. This became the soundtrack of their lives. The destruction was not limited to the land. Allied gunners began heating their cannonballs in special furnaces until they glowed cherry red. They fired these hot shot down into the York River. Soon the British warship Cierre was ablaze, a giant floating torch that lit up the entire night sky. British cannons were being dismounted from their positions one by one. Earthen walls crumbled under the relentless pounding, and buildings in the town were reduced to splinters. Cornwallis's defenses were being systematically dismantled before his eyes. The first parallel had done its job perfectly, But it was not enough to force a surrender. To win the siege, the Allies knew they had to get even closer. From the other side of the trench, the world was nothing but noise and dirt. For the 7,000 soldiers trapped in Yorktown, life had become a waking nightmare. The thunderous roar of the Allied guns was a constant physical presence. It was a concussion they felt in their bones, a vibration that never stopped. The very ground beneath them shook with each new impact. There was simply no escape from the relentless assault. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by permanent, adrenaline-fueled exhaustion. Every whistle of an incoming shell sent a fresh wave of terror through the lines. The psychological toll was becoming immense. Food quickly became a desperate obsession. The high command cut rations, then cut them again. Soldiers survived on scraps of salted meat and biscuits so hard they were nearly inedible. Soon, even that ran out. The army's horses, once a sign of pride and mobility, were now seen as the last resort. They led the once prized animals to the slaughter. Soldiers who had once cared for these animals now had to eat them. One Hessian officer wrote grimly in his diary about the experience. He described the very bad and tough horse meat that was now their only sustenance. As if the cannonballs weren't enough, an invisible enemy stalked the trenches. Smallpox, the great killer of the 18th century, began to spread like wildfire. The crowded fortifications were a perfect breeding ground. A fever could now fell men who had miraculously survived a cannon blast. Morale, already dangerously low, began to collapse entirely. These professional soldiers were trapped in a hell they could not fight. Above them, Cornwallis watched his army disintegrate before his very eyes. His letters to General Clinton in New York became increasingly frantic. He knew his position was becoming indefensible. On October 15th, he sent a stark message. He admitted plainly, "My situation now becomes very critical." The composed language of a general was gone, replaced by desperation. He confessed that his ability to hold out was so precarious. He could not recommend that the fleet and army should run any great risk in trying to save them. It was a quiet but unmistakable admission of defeat. He was telling his commander not to bother with a rescue. For the men shivering in the trenches, the message was clear. Help was not coming. Hope was the final casualty of the siege. The first bombardment had done its job, but it was not enough. The Allied cannons were still too far away to deliver a truly knockout blow. To finish the fight, the engineers needed to dig a second parallel. This new trench would be just a few hundred yards from Cornwallis's main line. There was just one problem. Two very stubborn British forts, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, stood directly in the way. These small, star-shaped earthen forts had to be taken by storm. This was not a job for cannons. It was a job for men with cold steel. This was the moment a young, ambitious officer had been waiting for. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, after years of serving as Washington's aide, was desperate for a combat command. He practically demanded the honor of leading the American attack. Washington, perhaps tired of his pestering, finally gave it to him. The plan for the night of October 14th was simple, terrifying, and brilliant. The soldiers would advance in total silence with unloaded muskets. This was to be a bayonet-only assault. The reasoning was sound. A single premature gunshot could alert the defenders and ruin the surprise. As darkness fell, the operation began. Two columns moved forward with grim determination. The French under Colonel Wilhelm von Zweibrücken charged Redoubt 9. At the same time, Hamilton led his 400 Americans toward Redoubt 10. They scrambled through the sharpened wooden stakes meant to slow them down. They hacked a path forward with axes under the cover of night. Hamilton was one of the first over the wall, with his men right behind him. The fighting inside was brutal, personal, and mercifully short. In less than 10 minutes, Redoubt 10 was in American hands. The French assault on Redoubt 9 was equally swift and successful. The two great obstacles were gone. That very night, soldiers with shovels moved into the captured positions. They immediately began digging the trench that would connect the forts, completing the second parallel. The end was now very, very near. The capture of the redoubts was the final straw. Allied cannons now sat in the second parallel. They could fire down into the British lines with terrifying accuracy. The situation was no longer critical. It was impossible. For Cornwallis, there was only one move left on the board. It was not a move for victory, but for survival. He planned a desperate, last-ditch breakout. His plan was audacious. On the night of October 16th, he would attempt a secret evacuation. He decided to abandon his sick, his wounded, and all his heavy equipment. Under the cover of darkness, he would ferry his effective fighting force across the wide York River to Gloucester Point. From there, he hoped to smash through the smaller Allied force and begin a desperate march north to New York. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting in a trench waiting to die. The operation began after 10 in the afternoon. A small flotilla of 16 flatboats started the perilous journey back and forth across the dark, churning water. The first wave of troops, the elite guards, made it across safely. The boats returned and began loading the next units. For a few brief hours, it seemed the impossible might just work. A sliver of hope cut through the despair. Then the sky turned against them. What was a stiff breeze suddenly became a violent storm. A torrential downpour of rain was joined by furious winds. This sudden squall turned the river into a chaotic mess. The small, overloaded boats were scattered like leaves. Some were swept miles downriver. Soldiers clung to the sides as waves crashed over them, flooding the boats. By morning, the escape was a total failure. The army was now split, with a few hundred men stranded on the wrong side of the river. The boats were gone. Cornwallis's last gamble had been thwarted not by French cannons or American bayonets, but by the weather. Fate itself had slammed the door shut. There were no more plans. There was no more hope. There was only one option left. On the morning of October 17th, a strange sound drifted across the battlefield. After weeks of relentless noise, there was a sudden silence, broken only by the lonely beat of a one drum. A British drummer boy had climbed onto a ruined parapet, beating the call for a parley. Shortly after, a British officer appeared beside him, waving a white handkerchief as a sign of truce. The guns fell quiet along the entire line. The bombardment had finally stopped. The officer was blindfolded and led through the maze of trenches to the Allied command. He carried a short note from Cornwallis. It proposed a ceasefire to negotiate the terms of surrender. Washington, now in complete control, sent back a firm reply. He would grant a 2-hour truce, but demanded to see Cornwallis's proposals in writing first. There would be no time wasting. The real negotiation took place at a nearby farmhouse, the Moore House. There, American and French officers met with their British counterparts to hammer out the details of the capitulation. For the most part, the terms were standard for a siege. But on one point, Washington was absolutely unmovable. The British demanded to be granted the full honors of war, a military tradition allowing a defeated army to march out with dignity. This would let them keep their flags flying and their bayonets fixed. It was the gentleman's way of losing a fight. Washington said no. He remembered all too well the humiliating surrender of the American army at Charleston the year before. The British had denied them the honors of war then. Now, it was his turn to set the rules. He insisted on a precise and symbolic form of payback. The British would march out with their flags cased and their bayonets sheathed. Their bands would not be allowed to play an American or French tune. The terms were harsh, pointed, and non-negotiable. Cornwallis had no choice but to accept. The articles of capitulation were finalized. October 19, 1781, was a day of brilliant sunshine. Two long lines of soldiers, stretching for over a mile, formed on the road leading out of Yorktown. They waited in disciplined silence for the final act to unfold. On one side stood the French army, immaculate in their white uniforms, a picture of European military precision. On the other stood the Continental Army, a motley but proud collection of veterans in faded blue and buckskin. They had waited years for this very moment. Between these silent ranks, the defeated British Army began its final march. Their uniforms were torn and stained with the dirt of the siege. Their faces were sullen, their movements heavy with humiliation. Legend says their bands played a fitting tune for the occasion. The world turned upside down. While historians debate this detail, no song could have better captured the unbelievable reality of the moment. A superpower had been humbled. At the head of the column rode not Cornwallis, but his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara. The British commander claimed he was too ill to attend his own surrender. It was a final petty snub from a general who could not bear to face his conquerors. O'Hara rode first toward the French commander Rochambeau. He attempted to surrender his sword to a fellow European aristocrat rather than a colonial rebel, but Rochambeau simply shook his head and gestured across the road toward Washington. When O'Hara approached the American commander, Washington performed a masterstroke of symbolic justice. He refused to accept the sword. Instead, he directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. It was Lincoln who had endured the humiliating surrender at Charleston, denied the full honors of war by the British. Now, it was Lincoln who formally accepted the sword of the defeated army. The circle of justice was complete. One by one, the British and Hessian soldiers marched to a designated field. They sullenly threw down their muskets, creating a growing pile of discarded steel. The war was not officially over, but on that sunny field, everyone knew it had just been won. For over a month, the world held its breath, suspended by the speed of a single ship sailing the Atlantic. The news of Yorktown traveled not by telegraph, but by wind and wave. It was a slow, agonizing journey that carried the fate of an empire in its cargo hold. On the evening of November 25, that ship finally arrived. A messenger, still covered in the dust of the road, rushed to the London residence of the Prime Minister, Lord North. For years, North had prosecuted a deeply unpopular and ruinously expensive war in America. He was a man under immense political pressure. The colonial secretary delivered the dispatch. According to his account, Lord North received the news as he would have taken a ball in the breast. He paced his room in frantic agitation, repeatedly saying the same four words. They were not a political statement. They were a cry of pure despair. Oh God, it is all over. In that moment, he knew this was not just another military setback. This was a political death sentence. The loss of an entire professional army, surrendered in such a spectacular and undeniable fashion, shattered what little political will remain to continue the fight. The war was no longer just unpopular. It was now seen as utterly unwinnable. The reaction in Parliament was immediate and savage. The opposition, who had long argued against the war, now had the ultimate proof of the government's failure. Lord North's majority in the House of Commons began to evaporate. Every debate became a painful post-mortem on the disastrous American campaign. Though his government clung to power for a few more agonizing months, the end was inevitable. In March 1782, facing a vote of no confidence he was certain to lose, Lord North finally resigned. The government that had lost America was gone. The military victory at Yorktown had achieved its final, decisive objective. It had toppled the British government, and opened the door to peace. With Lord North's government gone, a new one came to power in London. This new government had one clear mandate from a war-weary public: make peace. The war on the battlefield was over. The war at the negotiating table was just beginning. The new stage for this conflict was not a muddy trench, but the lavish drawing rooms of Paris. America sent a small but formidable team of diplomats to secure the victory their soldiers had won. This was a team of clashing personalities. You had the elderly Benjamin Franklin, a global superstar of science and politics. He was a master of charm who knew exactly how to play the European courts. Alongside him was John Adams, a brilliant but famously grumpy lawyer from Massachusetts. Adams trusted no one, especially not the French, and was determined to fight for every square inch of American territory. He was the bulldog to Franklin's silver fox. The negotiations were a complex game of international chess. The Americans didn't just have to deal with the British. Their French allies had their own agenda. They had helped America to weaken Britain, not to create a powerful new rival. The Spanish, who were also involved, had their own territorial ambitions. The biggest fights were over two issues. First was territory. The British wanted to confine the new United States to a narrow strip along the Atlantic coast. Adams and his team demanded everything east of the Mississippi River. The second issue was the fate of the Loyalists, the Americans who had remained loyal to the king. The British insisted they be compensated for their lost property. After months of tense back and forth, a deal was finally struck. The Americans, in a clever move, negotiated a separate peace directly with the British, bypassing their French allies. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. It was a stunning victory. Great Britain formally recognized the United States as a free and independent nation. The war that had started with a few musket shots 8 years earlier was, at long last, officially over. The surrender at Yorktown was not just a single battle. It was a perfect storm, a rare moment in history where every gear in a complex machine clicked into place. A British general made a fatal miscalculation. A French admiral took a career-defining gamble. At the same time, an American commander saw his one last chance and seized it with both hands. He bet the entire revolution on a single, audacious move. So, was the French contribution the deciding factor? Let's be blunt about it, absolutely. There is no victory at Yorktown without France. Without Admiral de Grasse's fleet sealing the Chesapeake, Cornwallis simply sails away. Without Rochambeau's professional soldiers and heavy cannons, the American army would have been staring at impenetrable walls. The alliance was a calculated move in a global power struggle between empires. But for America, it was everything. It was the ships, the soldiers, and the silver that turned a desperate hope into a battlefield reality. For George Washington, this was his masterpiece. The victory forever transformed his reputation from a general known for grit and survival into a brilliant grand strategist. He proved he could think on a global scale. He abandoned his obsession with New York and coordinated a secret 450-mile march with a complex naval operation. This victory silenced his critics and cemented his place as the indispensable leader of the revolution. The shockwaves were felt across the globe. For the British Empire, it was more than a military defeat. It was a humiliating public lesson that their power had limits, a lesson they would not soon forget. The surrender encouraged other independence movements around the world. It also fueled republican ideals in places like France itself, setting the stage for future upheavals. The world had been turned upside down, and London felt the ground shake. More than anything, Yorktown became a cornerstone of American identity. It was the ultimate underdog story, the physical proof that a young republic could defeat the most powerful nation on earth. It became a powerful symbol of what was possible through unity, bold leadership, and sheer perseverance. The Treaty of Paris would make independence official on paper, but the argument was truly settled here, in the mud and cannon smoke of a Virginia tobacco port. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to 1781. The story of Yorktown is a powerful reminder of how a single, well-laid trap can change the course of history. It's a tale of strategy, desperation, and unlikely alliances that secured the birth of a nation. We hope you found this exploration as fascinating as we did. If you enjoyed this video and want more deep dives into pivotal moments of the past, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible stories to light. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.